John Dean, among your 10 books, Pure Goldwater, co-written by Barry Goldwater's son. And in the book, you compare Barry Goldwater to Harry Truman. How so?
Well, he's one of those guys who has, over the years, his positions have gotten forgotten, his specifics, and he's really become to be viewed by partisans on both sides as somebody who was really a straight shooter, who told it the way it was, who had the respect of a wide spectrum. And I think as history has passed, he is in that category, regardless of whether you agreed or disagreed with him at the time. You look at him now as somebody who really had the best interest of the country in mind and spoke his mind, and that has a certain charm and certain good reception with the average voter. So I think there's a nice comparison.
And as you write, admired for his principles, is there somebody on the national stage today that is a Barry Goldwater?
I'm looking for him. I'm not sure there is. There are people who speak their mind, but he became a unique figure in American politics because of his outspokenness and his. He took a very unpopular position at the time. Conservatism was very young when he started a movement and made it very sensible. It was very common sense conservatism. We don't have somebody who's starting a movement quite like that I see today, at least hasn't surfaced on my radar.
When did you first meet Barry Goldwater?
When I was 13 years old. His son and I were roommates in prep school. We would travel up here to Washington from Stanton, Virginia, where we were in school. We would visit with him. It was very impressive. You know, here was this very tall, handsome figure who you'd walk down the Senate corridors with him, and he'd be kind of create a wake with the various police people and other people giving him way. He'd take us around the Senate. He drove a 1957 at that time Thunderbird that was geared up like it was the cockpit of an airplane. It had more gadgets and stuff. So for teenage boys, and being a teenager, he was a man's man and a great figure and a very charismatic person for a young guy.
One of the other words that comes up a lot in Pure Goldwater is honesty. Explain.
Well, Pure Goldwater, to put it in context, is just that. I'd read the senator's autobiographical works where he had worked with co-authors, and I don't think they ever found this material. And years later, in talking to him, he had told me he'd taken a lot of material that he had composed over the years and put it in the Arizona Historical Foundation. I hadn't seen that in his books, and when he and I were going to do another project, I looked at that and realized at that time, I said, you know, there's really good stuff in here, and it is pure Goldwater because it's not by a speechwriter, it's not by a staff person, it's the senator, and it goes from everything from a personal diary he kept starting when his son died, or excuse me, when his son was born, until his own death. And it's not regular, but it's enough of it that you really get a sense of the man through a lot of years. It's very personal. He hammered it out on a little portable typewriter when he was first starting it. Later, when electronic dictation became available, he would dictate it and it would be transcribed. And it wasn't well filed initially, but the archivist got it in order. And when I looked at it, I said to Barry Jr., I said, you know, this tells more about your dad, I think, in many ways than the autobiographies he's done. And it is, you know, we get his sense of humor, we get his position on various figures in politics. The surprise to me was the depth of the material on Nixon I found in the book, which I was very surprised with. It's the subject his diary got the most attention for. So it made an interesting work to put it together, given the fact it was so original.
I want to get to the Nixon material in just a moment. Just to put it in context, Barry Goldwater elected back in 1952. He ran for the presidency and so gave up his Senate seat in 1964, then came back in 1968, was elected, and served for another 18 years.
Right.
But he ran in 1964 knowing that he was going to lose to Lyndon Johnson. Why?
A matter of principle in many regards. He had been visiting the South, giving a lot of speeches in the South, realized there was a whole body of thought down there and a number of people whose views weren't really getting expressed through the Democratic Party at that time. They liked him, he liked them, and he thought it was time for the Republicans to make some serious inroads into the South. The part his diary is the weakest on is the material regarding the '64 campaign. That's the smallest bit of the material. In fact, we found some letters. We decided not to use the letters because they weren't quite the same as the diary entries. Just a few of those where he was a little bitter at the end. He thought that the press treatment was pretty rough in '64. If you recall, there was a lawsuit that he was provoked after '64 because a group of psychiatrists got together and polled. One person polled all psychiatrists, and they said he was psychologically unfit to be president. He didn't much take to that, so he decided to file a defamation suit. And I used a little bit of the deposition in that case in the book because, again, it was Pure Goldwater coming out. So I think he ran in '64, to answer your question, to make some points, to lay a predicate for what would later become the conservative movement and would be followed up by Ronald Reagan. And without Goldwater in '64, you wouldn't have had Ronald Reagan later.
You compare the style of Richard Nixon after he lost in 1962 when he ran for governor of California to the statement of Barry Goldwater in 1964. And in the statement he said, quote, "I'd never seen or heard in my life," going back to the issue of the media, "such vitriolic, unbiased attacks on one man as had been directed to me. I've never in my life seen such inflammatory language as been used by some men who know better. I think these people, for their frankly, shoddy behavior, should hang their head in shame because I think they've made the Fourth Estate a sorry, sad mess."
I think the only thing that would differ from what Nixon said is you don't have Barry Goldwater to kick around anymore. He didn't add that. He was very, very upset. In fact, he famously said, you know, if I had to vote for the Goldwater who was portrayed in the media in '64, I wouldn't have voted for him. He said, that wasn't me. I didn't recognize the character that the media portrayed. So he had a very tough time in '64 with the media, and he was provoked at that post-election press conference to lay it out for what it was.
He loved his typewriter, didn't he?
He loved it was actually a little portable typewriter. He would take it out on his camping trips with him. Typed pretty well, but we had found a few errors we had to correct. But he actually it got much fuller when he was able to dictate.
There are two entries I want to ask you to elaborate on. One is from January 27th, 1971. And he's writing about Richard Nixon. This is in his diary, not a letter to the then president. "Looking back over the past several months, I continue to be amazed at the ineptitude that President Nixon has shown in the operation of government. This amazes me because if there is a politically astute animal in American politics, it is Dick Nixon," said Barry Goldwater. "I believe the trouble to be in that he has allowed himself to be surrounded by people who really aren't too smart in the field of politics, so he does not know what is going on."
He shared with his diary his thoughts, many of which he had actually shared with the president in some of their conversations. He stayed with Nixon, as we all know, right up until the end, and then some. After Nixon went to San Clemente, and he would go out and visit him in San Clemente, trying to see how his temperature was. And it's very late in the game that Barry Goldwater finally breaks rank with Richard Nixon, because Nixon is really trying to cause a hard time for Jerry Ford when Ford was going to run for president. And Goldwater got disgusted. He said, you know, this man's been lying to me for a long time, and I've had it. And they just broke, and after that, there was never any relationship further.
In a letter that he wrote to Richard Nixon, June 20th, 1973, still very much supportive of the president, he began by saying, "Dear Mr. President, frankly, I think I should start over by saying Dear Dick, because I'm writing to myself, as you will quickly detect." And it was a letter that he penned on his typewriter, talked about the people surrounding him in the White House, and also said, "You need to come to Congress. People in Congress need to know that their president is listening to them. He also mentions Watergate in this letter. Can you elaborate?
Yeah,